Thebes, Egypt, year 1230 before Christ. The air above the Nile shimmered with heat as the sun sank behind the pillars of Karnak temple. Inside its deepest chamber, the scent of incense and resin filled the air, while priests moved in silence, their torches flickering against painted gods. At the center lay Neferet, daughter of the high priest of Amun, her body trembling beneath layers of linen. The chants rose louder to drown her muffled breath. Outside, the city still celebrated the festival of the river. Inside, a girl was being mummified before death could claim her naturally. Neferet had been born beneath the shadow of the great columns of Karnak, where her first cry echoed against stone walls older than memory. Her father, Rahotep, was the high priest of Amun, a man whose word could move armies and silence kings. To him, Neferet was not a daughter, but an offering. Her childhood unfolded within the temple's vast courtyards, surrounded by chants, incense, and watchful eyes. She learned to bow before idols before she learned to play, to recite prayers before she learned her own reflection. The women of the temple dressed her in linen robes, brushed her hair with oils, and whispered that she was chosen. She would be a bride of the god, untouched, unbound, eternal. To the priests, her innocence was sacred. To Neferet, it was a chain. Thebes in those years pulsed with wealth and splendor. The streets beyond the temple walls were alive with music, merchants, and children running through the dust. Sometimes, at dusk, Neferet would gaze through the narrow lattice of her chamber, watching them as the sun turned the Nile into molten gold. She envied their laughter, their freedom to touch, to love, to live without fear of offending heaven. Her only companion was the silence of the temple statues and the echo of her own heart. One evening, during the festival of Opet, when the sacred bark of Amun was carried through the city, Neferet glimpsed a face in the crowd, a young scribe named Khemu, his hands ink-stained, his eyes bright with curiosity. He bowed as the procession passed, but his gaze lingered, meeting hers for the briefest instant. It was a look that should have meant nothing, yet to Neferet it shattered the world she had been taught to accept. That night, as the moonlight poured through the columns, she lay awake, hearing his voice, though he had not spoken a word. For the first time, she wondered if the gods she served demanded purity or obedience. The question itself was her first sin. In the months that followed, she sought reasons to leave her chamber to deliver scrolls, to fetch water, to walk the same courtyards where Khemu worked. Their exchanges were few, their words simple, but her heart learned the shape of rebellion. Love was forbidden for a daughter of Amun, yet it bloomed quietly between them, hidden beneath the scent of papyrus and incense. And though neither knew it, the same walls that had sheltered Neferet since birth would one day become her tomb. The days that followed her father's warning felt heavier than stone. The temple walls that once seemed vast and holy now pressed against Neferet like a tomb. Every sound a footstep in the corridor, the rustle of linen made her flinch. The whispers had grown sharper. Servants who once smiled now turned away, muttering prayers under their breath, as if her presence alone could anger the gods. She had not seen Khemu since that night in the courtyard, and she feared that even thinking his name might draw the attention of the priests. The temple air smelled of incense and fear. Her father's eyes, once filled with pride, had turned to suspicion. He spoke to her rarely now, addressing her only in front of witnesses, his words formal, stripped of affection. The man who had raised her to believe she was divine now looked at her as if she were cursed. The silence between them hurt more than any punishment could. One morning, while she prepared the sacred oils for the ritual of dawn, a young servant girl named Iset approached her in secret. Her hands trembled as she whispered, "They are saying you spoke with a man outside the gates." Neferet froze. The words cut through her like a blade. "Who says this?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Iset replied softly, "The priests are gathering tonight. They say the god has been offended." Fear spread through Neferet's veins, cold and paralyzing. The priests did not meet to forgive. They met to condemn. She remembered Khemu's voice, calm, kind, full of life, and felt a desperate longing to hear it once more. That night she waited by the lattice of her chamber window, hoping to catch a glimpse of him in the torchlight below, but the courtyard was empty. Only the chants of the priests echoed through the darkness, low and ominous. The following day, Her father summoned her to the inner sanctum. The air was thick with smoke, and a circle of priests stood behind him, their faces painted with solemn purpose. "You have been accused of impurity," Rahotep said, his tone heavy but controlled. "If the gods find you unworthy, they will claim you." His words felt like stone falling into her chest. "Father," she began, but he raised his hand. "Do not speak. Purity is proven through silence." She understood then that he had already made his decision. To question him would be to blaspheme, to resist would be to die as a sinner. She lowered her eyes, her tears falling onto the cold stone floor. As the priests began their prayers, she realized that her fate was no longer her own. The temple that had once protected her now prepared to bury her in its name. That night, the torches outside Neferet's chamber burned until dawn. She lay awake listening to the chants echoing through the corridors, each syllable striking her heart like a hammer. The priests prayed for cleansing, for the removal of sin from the house of Amun, but she knew those prayers were meant for her. The temple had turned against her completely. Servants no longer brought her food. Her chamber door was guarded. The other priestesses avoided her eyes. Only the faint drip of water from the stone ceiling reminded her that time was still moving. She tried to pray as she had been taught, yet the words felt empty. How could the gods she served now thirst for her life? Her only thought was of Khemu. She pictured him in the city, perhaps unaware of what she faced, or perhaps imprisoned like her. The memory of his gentle voice kept her from breaking, though every breath felt like it might be her last. At dusk, the guards came for her. They said nothing as they led her through the torch-lit corridors toward the chamber of judgment. The scent of incense and myrrh hung thick in the air. When the doors opened, she saw her father seated upon the dais, surrounded by the priests of Amun, their faces painted with divine authority. Between them stood a stone basin filled with water, the basin of truth. If she was pure, they said, the water would remain calm. If she was guilty, it would ripple under the gaze of the gods. Neferet's knees trembled as she approached. Her father's expression did not change. "You stand accused of breaking your vows," he said quietly. "A daughter of Amun must be untouched by mortal desire. Do you confess?" His voice was neither angry nor kind. It was the tone of a man surrendering to faith over blood. Neferet raised her head. "I have served the gods all my life," she said, her voice barely steady. "If they find fault in me, let them speak." Her words were brave, but fear tightened her chest as she reached for the basin. The water reflected her face, pale, trembling, alive. She held her breath, waiting for the ripples. For a moment, the surface remained still. Then, as if moved by an unseen hand, the water quivered. Gasps filled the hall. A priest stepped forward, declaring, "The gods have spoken. She is unclean." The chamber erupted into prayer. Her father's hands clenched the armrests of his chair. He did not look at her. He only whispered, "May the gods forgive us both." Neferet was dragged away as the chants grew louder, the priests thanking Amun for revealing impurity. She did not resist. Her tears fell silently, absorbed by the dust beneath her feet. In that moment, she understood what the water had truly revealed, not the will of the gods, but the fear of men who worshipped their own power more than any heaven above them. They took her beneath the temple before dawn, down a narrow passageway that reeked of oil and damp stone. The air grew colder with every step, the flicker of torches casting twisted shadows across the carved walls. Neferet's wrists were bound with linen strips, her ankles heavy with bronze cuffs. The priests walked ahead in silence, their heads lowered as if ashamed, yet none dared to defy what had been decreed. When they reached the lowest chamber, the scent of myrrh and resin struck her like a wave. The room was small, lined with jars of sacred oils and baskets of linen, the same materials used for the dead. At its center stood a stone table surrounded by statues of the gods, their painted eyes fixed upon her. It was then that Neferet understood what awaited her. She was not to be purified, she was to be entombed. Her father was already there, standing beside the high priest. His face was unreadable, a mask carved from sorrow and devotion. "The gods demand restoration," the high priest said. "Her flesh must be sealed before sin spreads to the holy ground." Rahotep nodded, though his eyes never met his daughter's. The guards forced Neferet to her knees. She did not cry out. There was no mercy left in this place. The women who once dressed her for ceremonies now approached with trembling hands, dipping cloth into oil and wrapping it around her arms. Each layer tightened her breath. The chant began low, rhythmic, and endless. The priests circled her, speaking words she could no longer hear. Her pulse thundered in her ears as they bound her torso, her legs, her shoulders. The linen clung to her skin, warm and suffocating. She tried to call her father's name, but her voice broke beneath the chanting. He turned away. When the wrappings reached her neck, a tear escaped her eye, rolling into the folds of cloth. A priest brushed it away as if it were an impurity. They spoke of purification, but what she felt was erasure. Her body turned into a relic before her soul had left it. The high priest poured resin over her chest, sealing the fabric into a hardened shell. Her heartbeat slowed beneath it, faint but defiant. As they lowered her onto the cold stone table, Neferet's gaze met the statue of Amun towering above her, its eyes gleaming in the torchlight. She had spent her life serving that image, believing it to be love. Now it watched her die without a sound. The chamber grew still as the final layer covered her face. The linen pressed against her lips, muffling her last breath. The priests placed amulets upon her chest, muttering blessings for an afterlife she had not yet entered. When the door was sealed and the torches snuffed out, only silence remained. And in that silence, the gods heard nothing, only the sound of a girl's heartbeat fading beneath the weight of her own sanctity. The temple above returned to its rhythm as though nothing had happened. Incense burned, offerings were made, hymns filled the air, and the people of Thebes bowed in reverence to the same gods who had demanded Neferet's death. Only the chamber beneath the floor knew the truth. Days passed, and the priests sealed the entrance with stone, marking it with prayers of purity. Her father avoided that part of the temple, though every night he dreamed of the sound of her voice. The high priest told him it was a blessing, a sign that her soul had ascended to the field of reeds. But Rahotep knew the difference between blessing and guilt. In his dreams, her voice was not singing, it was calling his name. The city celebrated the festival of renewal soon after. The Nile rose high and generous, and the people praised Amun for his mercy. Yet mercy was a word that no longer held meaning for Rahotep. He had given his only daughter to the gods, and in return, he had received silence. Months later, strange rumors began to ripple through the temple. Servants whispered of footsteps echoing beneath the floor at night, of faint scratching behind the walls. The high priest dismissed it as imagination, but some said the gods were restless. One evening, when the torches burned low, Rahotep descended alone into the lower chambers, his lamp flickering as he walked. The air was heavy, the silence unbearable. He reached the sealed wall and placed his hand upon the cold stone. There was no sound now, only the memory of her breath trapped inside. His knees weakened, and for the first time in his life, the high priest of Amun prayed not to the gods, but to the soul he had buried. He whispered her name forbidden even in death, and begged forgiveness. The stone gave no answer. Decades later, the temple fell into ruin. Wind and sand devoured its grandeur, and the gods carved into its walls were forgotten. But centuries after Rahotep's death, when the tombs beneath Thebes were excavated by foreign hands, they found a sealed chamber untouched by time. Inside lay the remains of a young woman, her linen wrappings hardened into armor. Unlike other mummies, her mouth was open not in peace, but in protest. Her arms were bound close to her chest, but her fingers were curled as if she had fought until her last breath. The archaeologists called it unusual, the historians called it ritual, but the truth was written on her bones. Neferet had not been purified, she had been silenced. And though her name had been erased from every record, her story outlived the gods that condemned her. Her father had believed that the gods would forget her sin. Instead, time forgot the gods and remembered the girl who dared to live before she was allowed to die. Centuries passed before anyone spoke Neferet's name again. The desert had swallowed the temple whole, leaving only fragments of columns jutting from the sand like bones. It was in the early years of the modern age that an English expedition uncovered the ruins of Karnak's forgotten chambers. Among the dust and broken statues, the archaeologists found a sealed passageway carved with strange markings, not the proud inscriptions of pharaohs, but warnings. It took days to break through the stone, and when they finally opened it, the air that escaped was dry and heavy, as if the chamber itself had been holding its breath. Inside, they found the body of a young woman. Her linen wrappings were fused to her skin. Her body twisted slightly as though she had struggled long after the tomb was sealed. Around her lay amulets of protection and symbols of purity, yet her expression was not peaceful. It was terror, frozen in time. The lead archaeologist recorded that her heart had been found intact, unremoved, a sign that she had not been dead when she was buried. The discovery unsettled even the most skeptical minds. News of the living mummy spread through Cairo and across Europe. Scholars debated whether it was a punishment, an accident, or an ancient ritual of sacrifice. But one inscription, etched faintly on a wall beside her, silenced their arguments. It read, "She was offered to the god for the cleansing of sin." Those words revealed what centuries of silence had hidden, that Egypt's quest for divine order had demanded human suffering. The mummy, once a daughter and a priestess, became a relic of both holiness and horror. Her story was retold in whispers, each version more tragic than the last. Some called her the bride of Amun, others the unfinished soul. Yet no one spoke of her as she truly was. Neferet, a girl whose only crime was to love beyond the walls built by men who feared their gods. As the sun set over the ruins, one of the workers who helped unseal the tomb lit a candle and placed it beside her body. "May your spirit rest," he murmured, his voice echoing faintly in the hollow chamber. Outside, the desert wind began to rise, sweeping through the cracks of the temple. The sands that once buried her now seemed to mourn her, whispering her name across the dunes. Neferet's story became legend, a warning of faith twisted into control, of purity used as punishment. Her name was no longer written in gold, but it endured in truth carved not in stone, but in memory. And though the gods who demanded her death had long turned to dust, the silence of her tomb still speaks louder than their prayers, reminding the world that even holiness can become a grave when power hides behind its mask. If her story unsettled you, remember this: the most terrifying things humanity ever did were not born from hate, but from devotion. Across centuries and civilizations, faith has been used to sanctify cruelty, and obedience has buried more lives than war ever could. Neferet's death is not just Egypt's sin, it is a mirror reflecting every age that silences its daughters in the name of purity. Do not let her voice fade again. Tell her story, because history repeats what we refuse to remember.